Hello, everybody, and welcome to Friends of the Force. I'm your host, Sarah.
And I'm your host, Brad.
And on today's episode, we are so delighted to welcome back for the third time on this podcast, Alexander Freed, for his latest novel that has just come out from Random House Worlds and Star Wars, Reign of the Empire, Mask of Fear.
What a title. What a catchy title. Reign of the Empire, you sold me. Mask of Fear, oh, do I love Andor. I'm in. Let me read this book. Spoiler alert, we read it.
We have, yeah. We're definitely going to talk about this title in this interview among so many other high-level things about this book. No spoilers here, although if you know about the book, which I hope you do, and know what time period it takes place in, which I hope you already do, considering the title is Reign of the Empire. So right at the Reign of the Empire, there's some really interesting things to dig into this time period. And Alexander Freed absolutely does dig into both the characters and the time in a way that we have not quite seen it before. If you are a fan of Andor, you're going to love this book if you haven't read it already. If you are a fan of this book, you're going to love Andor if for some reason you haven't watched it already. I am really just champion number one. I have the foam finger of like number one Alexander Freed book fan.
Wait, I have that same foam finger actually. Where did you buy yours?
They did mass produce it. They did make a couple of them, so I'm glad we both have them. But alongside this book, we've had the opportunity to talk to Alexander Freed here on Friends of the Force for both Shadowfall and Victor's Price, which are part of the Alphabet Squadron trilogy. And in addition to those excellent books, among my very, very favorites, he's also written Battlefront Twilight Company and the Rogue One novelization. All of these books are spectacular, and you really can't go wrong. And we hope that you will enjoy this interview today as we discuss so many politicians in the Star Wars galaxy. So without further ado, here is our interview with Alexander Freed.
First off, welcome back to the world of Star Wars. 4 years is far too long to go without a novel from you, so we're so happy to have you back. But how does it feel to have Mask of Fear now out in the world for people to read?
It's always an amazing privilege to get to do one of these things, right? It's wonderful that people ask me to do it at all, and then when the book comes out, yeah, it's a joyous occasion. It's a weird time to be releasing such a political book, and I don't know sort of what that means for sort of the lens that people are going to read it through. But, hopefully it is, hopefully it gives people something to chew on rather than just feels, like something that people don't want to deal with. But overall, it feels wonderful to be in the fold and to have this chance to communicate with folks.
I'll say as a reader, yes, the politics of the day are incredibly difficult, but there is still that bit of escapism when you jump into the politics of Star Wars. And so I think that there's a lot that readers will be able to come to and will continue to come to in this book. And while they might recognize some of the pains of politics of the moment in the book, it still feels a little disconnected from our world. And so I can live in both, and so I appreciate that as a reader, and I hope others will as well, because there's so much interesting stuff in this book. But before we get in the book, we see the title, which it's when that came out, I was just mind blown. So good. It's a direct callback to Nemik's manifesto from Andor, where he says that oppression is the mask of fear. How did this quote, resonate when you first heard it? And did it come back into your mind for the title? How did it become the title of this book?
Yeah, so I'm going to give you the most disappointing answer possible to this one, which is that it was not my suggestion. I don't remember who came up with it, whether it was on the Random House side or the Lucasfilm side. Obviously, a book like this, it's a collaborative process, right? There's a lot of ideas that get flung around, and yeah, some of them go through the gears many times and come out very differently. Sometimes it is, oh, well, that's just brilliant. That works fine. Yes, let's put that in there. But yeah, so it was proposed by someone on the team. I needed to actually look it up to remember where it was from. I had seen Andor, certainly. It's a tremendous show, but the that particular bit had not stuck with me as the whole show just sort of washed over me and left its impression. But it works well for the book, I think. I hope. It's it works sort of on two levels, right? Like there's the element in which it is there's its native environment, right? In the context, oppression is the mask of fear. It's talking, very much about the notion that an oppressive autocracy, it puts forth the strongman image, but beneath it, it is fundamentally fragile. And for this book, we are in the image phase, right? Like the cracks beneath the surface have not yet been revealed. It is kind of all mask at this phase in the timeline, but that doesn't mean that there is not fragility underneath. It just hasn't yet been exposed. The other level that it works on, and I feel like this cannot be underplayed, is it's a wonderful pulpy science fiction space opera title, right? It fits right in there with something like The Phantom Menace or Star Wars, right? Like it is, without the original context, it just sounds like over the top cool stuff, the mask of fear, right? So, and that is very much part of what Star Wars is about, right? Star Wars can explore a lot of delicate, nuanced, thoughtful issues, but it always has those pulp trappings to it, and that's part of what makes Star Wars fun. Um, so I think that the title does a nice job of capturing both of those elements.
Definitely.
Totally. Yeah. I love that you mentioned the fragility of oppression and like Nemec saying, authority is brittle. And I think of Matthew Stover's great line, one lone candle holds back the dark, right? So all it takes is that one spark, that one candle. And in this book, I think that comes through some legislation, some politicking. So there's a lot of that in here in those small acts of resistance. What is it about this time period though? Is it those small acts of resistance? The fact that there is an organized rebellion at this point. Like what interests you about this time period specifically, where it's like, yes, I got to come back and write Star Wars like very very early, 2 months after Order 66 at this point, or something like that.
Yeah, there's not only no rebellion, there's no clear sense that a rebellion is even needed. It's a really interesting time period in that, like, looking at the franchise as a whole, there aren't a lot of Star Wars stories that are told at what is effectively a time of peace. I'm not going to say it's a time of peace and prosperity, right? It's obviously a deeply disturbing, ominous time period that is going to get increasingly worse. But for the people living in the galaxy, the Clone Wars are over, right? The worst conflict that the galaxy has seen in living memory, it's done. The killing has stopped. That's a wonderful thing. The Empire has come into existence, right? The Emperor has declared himself to be supreme sovereign of the galaxy, but the Empire has not turned on its own people so much yet. It's doing it in subtle ways. It's doing it in targeted ways. Obviously, there's the purge of the Jedi, but that's not on a scale that affects your average Imperial citizen. So it is it is a time, it is a peace time, all right? And it feels so strange to put it that way, but that's part of the core tension of the era. It's part of the core tension of the book, is that this is a period when it can only get worse. but it's very hard to see that if you're living through it. Even if you're even if you're someone who is directly being targeted by the new empire, it's hard to believe just how bad it's going to get. No one's talking about Death Stars at this point. No one's talking about wiping out planets. It's a time of great uncertainty where the clear lines of good Jedi and evil Sith are obscured.
I think there's one point in the book where it was like maybe the people think that the Jedi's loss was worth the price of peace, and that line sat with me for a minute, and I was like, holy shit, like wow, and just I think that was really an interesting theme to grapple with throughout, and just putting it in that context is like so powerful and also like so alarming and so grim in some ways, and what is the price of peace truly?
It is grim. It's also a hard question if you're living through that. One of the things that and I'm just sort of going off on my own topics at this point. I apologize a bit for that, but we were talking about sort of the gap between Star Wars and the real world earlier. And one of the things that was incredibly important to me going into this was to make sure that this was grounded in the history of Star Wars as we knew it, which is very, very different from much anything going on in the real world, not just in the sense that we've got space wizards. Obviously, that is its own thing. But the notion of being at peace for decades or centuries, going through a horrifying civil war and making it through, it's hard not to blame anyone for going, no, we can't go back into this. And yeah, making sure that every element was considered from the angle of wait, okay, now what have these people actually lived through? Where have they gotten to, and how is that going to shape their perspective? That was incredibly important and often challenging because there's a lot of stuff that goes on with Star Wars, and it is very weird compared to our world.
It's also a bit difficult. There's like an entire galaxy worth of beings and people and all these things to consider. And there's a lot of moving factions just on its own outside of the politics specifically of the galaxy. But as you were talking, I can imagine, being a random being on a planet in the mid-rim, and as a viewer of Star Wars, we see how Palpatine rises, but the person who's living life in the Star Wars galaxy far, far away is not that close to the action. They, didn't see traitor or unlimited power, so there's a completely different perspective in universe than to us as fans of the stories that we're given. And I love it when we get to peel that back a little bit and move a little bit away from the center. And Andor is something that does that a bit, where it's not so close to the center. We have those moments with people like Mon Mothma, but we're focusing on one person. And obviously, like, Andor can't be left out of the conversation when we talk about this book, not only because of the timing of these releases, or the politics centered focus specifically, but also in reading the book, I was like, man, this book feels like the season of Andor. Everybody is a little bit disparate and doing their own thing. And by the end, we come together and have this moment. And then it's like episodes 7 and 8 of Andor season 1, and everything's like coming together. And you're like, oh my goodness, I can't believe they've done it. Did Andor's influence the framework and ideology in which you approached the story and its characters as you were crafting it?
I think it was less about Andor sort of being an ideological influence and more a sense of playing in the same sandbox overall. Right? This was a project that internally we never talked about as an Andor tie-in. It was always this is a book that we want to appeal to people to the same sorts of folk who really enjoy Andor. So it we didn't want to try to imitate Andor. Andor does its own thing and it does it incredibly well. But coming at it with an understanding that yes, it's okay to get into the sort of nitty gritty of these politics. To explore these groups from a factionalized, non-idealized perspective. Um, yeah, understanding that that was the lane that we were operating in. um and it's a pretty comfortable lane for me in a lot of respects. That's sort of my home in Star Wars, so that felt like, okay, yes, this is something we can do. And of course, there's a ton of direct uh, character ties to Andor, right? I'm not downplaying that in any way. We have a role for there's Mon Mothma, of course, her husband as well, who's introduced in the show. Saw a number of sort of elements in that respect.
Yeah, while it's not a direct Andor tie-in, I have to say when I first heard Andor was supposed to be 5 seasons and they whittled it down to 2, now my headcanon is that, hey, we got 3 Andor-like books. So technically we got those 5 seasons in my mind. I'll pretend. But yeah, I love I love that we're getting so much of the background on those characters, and Mon, Bail, Saw Gerrera really being the glue of the story, and they're not only featured in Andor but like so prominently throughout Star Wars, Clone Wars, Rebels, right? So many different points in their life. So did you revisit any of those stories to like help inform and round out their journey in this book, or maybe not even just revisit, but reference them and think of them to help kind of say where are they in their life at this moment?
This was a research heavy book, and I'm talking about just the Star Wars research alone was a lot of it. There's a lot of characters, a lot of events in the galaxy. So of course, Andor was in there for Mon Mothma. That's the big obvious stuff. But going through Saw's appearances in Clone Wars and Bad Batch and some of the video game material. Um, Bale pops up everywhere. There are there's stuff that I dived into, and then there's the stuff where I just sort of frantically worked my way through Wikipedia, going, okay, stuff to take note of, stuff to take note of. Need to ask Lucasfilm about this. Making sure that Bale and Mon's relationship, as established in books before the Clone War, or before and during the Clone Wars, was taken into account. Sources like the Rebel Files had a lot of little mentions about, like, okay, so there was a set of arrests of senators immediately after the ascension of the Emperor, which didn't get a lot of reference anywhere else. So that was okay, well, this is clearly incredibly important. How do we fold this into the plot? So yes, there was a lot of just trying to make everything line up perfectly, as well as getting the sense of where these characters were going and where they came from over the course of their careers, and trying to honor that, but also find an interpretation of all that that would still feel fresh, as opposed to fully expected, and thereby kind of less exciting.
I could see this being a fun project to go down the rabbit hole with. I mean, we even got the delegation of 2000, so like Rot's deleted scenes, a
Yes,
reference
no,
point.
that's I can't believe I forgot to mention that. Yes, the Revenge of the Sith deleted scenes are an absolute foundational piece of this book. That is probably the single most important bit of continuity that I built on, and it feels ridiculous to say that. Of course, the book works if you haven't seen those. I certainly hope the book works if you haven't seen those. But yes, thank you for reminding me of that.
I just love how a deleted scene becomes like the most canon thing imaginable. And that's like the beauty of Star Wars. It's all the same. um
Yes, no, and I don't remember where that even first came up, if it was mentioned in the very first meeting that I had with Random House and Lucasfilm. It might have there. I'm pretty sure at least the delegation of 2000 was name dropped, if not explicitly. Hey, you should go rewatch the deleted scenes if you haven't seen those, because those might be useful for this project.
Totally, totally valid. And, we can imagine the cut of the movie with the scenes in our mind as well. They are very, very canon. Speaking of kind of important moments that are or are not in Revenge of the Sith, we have a couple of epigraphs at the beginning of this book that are, I think, really poignant and set the tone. And what inspired the decision to, include both Palpatine's speech as well as my very favorite Padme outfit and line, "This is how Liberty dies," as the epigraphs of this book.
Yeah, that was another one of those that sort of went through the conversation among, writer, editor, Lucasfilm folk. And that was it didn't make it into the very first draft. I believe it came in between the first and second drafts, and it felt like a way to, one, just ground it in Star Warsiness, right? Both in the time period. It obviously tells us, hey, we are right here. If you are a fan of the movies, you recognize the moment, and that's your jumping off point for the book. And of course, it also works thematically on that level, right? This is the mission statement of the book. It is the death of democracy, essentially, and seeing seeing how and why people react to it the way that they do. It's a book that in many ways, despite having a lot of recognizable characters from Star Wars, it's not right in the middle of what we think of as film Star Wars, right? It's tonally distinct. It's not working with any of the marquee characters. Having something then to really tie it right back to the fundamentals, to the films. Um, I think it's a different sort of grounding, right? It's a way to establish, hey, this is within the larger cycle of what Star Wars means. And I think it served a purpose in doing that as well.
Yeah, it's also just a great juxtaposition to start the book, like back on the topic of like, hey, it's peacetime, and then the next page is like, this is how liberty dies. You're like, oh, see, it's kind of like
I
making
remember.
you're like, oh, right, yeah. So again, the cost of peace. But there are also just so many characters in this book, who in all of the politicking and who supports the empire, who doesn't. There's just such an array of characters. I have to call out Lud Maroy, by the way, local senator from Troith, which again, Shadowfall stands over here. That was very exciting to hear about the Cerberon moon and another Alexander Freed pull in your books that you always do. I love those. But thinking of Alphabet Squadron, right? That was a trilogy that you had a large cast of characters throughout three different books, and you're doing the same here with Saw, Mon, and Bale. But now you're just responsible for the first installment of a trilogy, and you have these characters to start with. So, like, what were some of the most important themes for you to establish for Mon and Bale and Saw that would allow them to continue to flourish throughout the rest of the books as you hand off the baton to Rebecca and Fran?
Yeah, so the way the trilogy is structured is the books are going to take place quite a number of years separated from one another, right? We've got essentially a 20-year period of the reign of the empire, and the books are going to be spread across that. So there wasn't the need to sort of set up, all right, this is the exact plot point that we need to end in, and Rebecca Rowan Horse is going to pick it up right here. It was much more of, let's lay out all the toys in the sandbox, right? Let's tell a self-contained story here, but establish enough new characters with enough different perspectives who could go enough different places over the years that the next book can take those in whatever direction the author really feels is going to make for the most compelling story there. I think in the end, the hope is that, for me certainly, that the three books exist in conversation with one another, rather than feeling like a direct, serialized, episodic, this is part one, two, and three of this story. Obviously, we want them to read together well. We want some through lines to exist with those core characters of Mon Mothma, Bail Organa, and Saw Gerrera. But I think one of the benefits of doing a multi-author trilogy for a project that is this sort of nuanced and thematically rich is that you're going to get different perspectives with each one. So my job, again, lay out those characters, establish where Mon, Bail, and Saw are at this point, focus on the story that feels right to almost exhaust everything that needs to be said about this period, while showing, yeah, these people are going to evolve into different versions of themselves, and we can see that here, but we're not going to fully understand what that looks like until the next book.
I really love what you set up here, not to explicitly spoil it for anybody, but if anybody has read it already, by the time you listen to this interview, chapter 68 is a really interesting one that I think is wonderfully complexly setting up the many avenues that these characters could head in the future as people who are on the same side, but people who are also see things quite differently from one another. And I absolutely enjoyed the ways in which they weaved in and out of each other's stories. But alongside like our legacy characters that we've seen before and that I truly do adore, we also have some new characters to love and hate and find complex and interesting in Sujin, Haki, and Chemish. They are all three so interesting and have such rich stories. We kind of are thinking about these three characters as in ways like the three foils to our protagonists. What did you hope that the introduction of these characters revealed about, the everyday life of the moment and not the non-politicians and the everyday people, as well as what do you hope that they expose about our, three heroes?
Yeah, so with a project like this, Mon, Bale, and Saw were always, again, they were going to be the through line through the trilogy. So they were the immovable pillars of this project, in the sense of, it didn't matter if I suddenly had a brilliant revelation that was, oh, I could literally write the best novel ever written if we just removed Bale and just had it as a Mon Saw duo. Like, no, that's not the project. Doesn't matter. You keep those three in, which is fine. That's part of the challenge and interest, of this kind of project. But that means that you do need to find ways to create other characters who are going to round out the gaps in that trio. So certainly part of it was trying to cover as great a breadth of the galactic social structure as possible. Obviously that's not actually going to happen. There are limits of what you can cover. It's a big galaxy. There are lots of different sorts of people. But you do the best you can to at least cover the ground where it feels like there's a lot changing. There's going to be interesting ways of shedding light on the themes of the time, and uh, that haven't been significantly covered in other material. So there's no Jedi, there's no clone, right? There have been great stories about Jedi characters and clone characters in this time period, but those stories already exist. We wanted to cover a different sort of ground. So, of course, we've got Sojin, who is a separatist. It felt almost impossible to write this story without having a major separatist character. The Separatist Confederacy was a significant portion of the galaxy. It's the reason there was a war. Any any future rebellion is going to exist in the shadow of the last civil war, and that civil war was instigated by people for reasons, and exploring those reasons and dealing with how they were reintegrated. It felt like it just had to be part of the project. Likewise, you've got Chemish, who exists sort of on the street level, right? This is a character who really thinks of themselves as largely apolitical. This is not their world. They're just trying to get by, making sure we had that point of view in there. And then, as you mentioned, Hockey, who is our window into the intelligence services, right? The folks who are in a unique position, not just to see the bureaucratic changes inside the empire, but also who are going to know a little bit more than everyone else, and also maybe not know the things that they think they know. So all of that's just answering the part of your question about sort of coverage and society, and trying to see what else is going on out there. But yes, they also reflect on those three main characters in a number of ways. Sojin exists in contrast with Saw, right? They're both fanatics in their way. They're both people who are consumed by their mission, and in many ways, Sojin is the man who Saw could become. Um, I think Saul probably realizes that to some extent, but is that really the direction he's going? Like, what's really going on inside Saul? That's a question that is largely left to the reader. But we get that contrast in there. Obviously, for folks who read the book, Hockey and Bale end up spending quite a lot of time together, and that's there we get to see a lot of Bale's gradual adjustment to what it actually means to operate under the eyes of spies and enemies. He's not a man with that sort of experience, so having Hockey in the mix is a way of teasing that out. And even a pairing like Mon and Chemish, and they're not characters who share tons of page time together, but getting a sense of the deep political insider, and then the perspective of what does the average person on the street think about Mon Mothma, the great backroom politician? Like, is she someone to admire? Is she someone to disdain? Is she just another politician? And what does that mean to people? So yes, it's they all serve as many purposes as I could stack on top of them, and it's a busy novel, maybe a little too busy at times, but hopefully just busy enough.
I made a map of how all the characters connected to each other because every time I could draw a new line, I was like, oh my gosh, and this person, connects to this person. And that is incredibly interesting because I loved to see how everything kind of came together. When I could connect that Hacky and Bale line, I was like, oh, things are really fascinating now. So I think it is, in my opinion, just busy enough where we kind of get to see all the threads weaving in ways that are really very satisfying.
Well, I'm certainly glad to hear that. I'm glad it largely worked. Yeah, I mean it's a book where, and again, I know we're in a spoiler-free conversation here, but the characters are very much reacting to one another as they move through their storylines, even when they are separated, and they are very very often separated. This is not a book about a group of people who get together and face one great villain. It is a group of people who are largely getting in one another's way and are one another's enemies to a large extent. Even when they've got the best will in the world towards one another, their paths are not always compatible, and so having that looping spiral of all the characters where every now and then they cross over, and it's it's usually not as good as one would hope, right? It's yes, things get worse before they get better.
Yeah, what happens when a bunch of
Right.
immovable objects start ramming into each other? And but I think that's what makes the book so compelling and like a page turner for me was that we're getting a lot of that in-depth character study, in between those inflection points throughout the book, and then when the paths do cross over, it's like oh, I really need to pay attention here because of what's being said or a choice that's being made or a philosophical conversation that's happening about like our fundamental beliefs and democracy and government, and so there's just so many there's so many great things to really analyze here. And you made a point about Sojin and how maybe Saw views himself as or Sojin as what he could become maybe if he continues down the path that he's on. And what I thought was particularly interesting was we don't get Saw's exact point of view in this book, but he still feels like a very central character despite never actually being in his mind. Everything we see through Saw is through Sojin's eyes. So I was curious what you're maybe hoping to, if you want to expand on the comment that you made, and what you were hoping readers might learn about Saw by only seeing him through Sojin's eyes.
Yeah, there were a couple of reasons for exploring it in that way, and some of them were practical, right? Some of them were about, all right, how many perspectives do we have in a given scene, and who's going to have the most at play, who's going to be the one who needs the most sort of internal explanation to even understand the motivations of what's going on with the plot. There was all that, but certainly on a higher level going in, I could have arranged the pieces differently. We could have been telling the story from Saul's perspective. There are a couple of reasons why I left him primarily being seen from the outside. Part of that is at this particular point in time, it felt like Saul was not necessarily going to be the most self-reflective of characters, and that we were going to get all the characters in this book are capable of deluding themselves about their own motivations. It varies a lot from character to character. Some of them have just a couple of blind spots. Some of them are all blind spot. Um, Saw felt like a character who getting his internal perspective would be less revealing about who he is than having a number of other characters looking at Saw and making their own estimates of who he is. And that's very much an element of where Saw is at this particular moment. That getting inside his head felt like, okay, yes, we'd learn something, but we'd learn it all from Saw's perspective, and Saw's perspective is not necessarily the most illuminating on who Saw is. He's a man of action. He's trying to get things done. He's not questioning himself a whole lot at this particular juncture. He, I think through this trilogy, the authors are all going to find the characters who work best at that point in time from other perspectives or from inside their own heads. I'm very much looking forward to seeing the Saw work that other authors do, and the alternative perspectives that Rebecca Roanhorse and Fran Wilde offer on characters like Mon and Bale. Again, it's a series that exists to be in conversation with itself. So I wasn't overly worried about, so long as Saw felt like a presence, so long as he felt like an important part of this book. It didn't necessarily feel necessary to always be seeing things through his eyes.
Totally, totally. And can I just say too, whenever you say Rebecca Roanhorse and Fran Wilde, I get goosebumps. I'm just like, can we just acknowledge that we have some heavy hitters with this trilogy?
It's
It's
a good
really
lineup.
incredible. Yeah, it
Yeah,
was so good. I was like, we got everybody coming back. This is amazing. So
I
good.
was like, oh my gosh, Lucasfilm Random House Worlds has put this together for me. This is the exact book trilogy with some of my favorite authors that I've been waiting for, with some of my favorite characters. So here we are, and I've enjoyed this first book. So I'm looking forward to Rebecca and Fran's installments as well, because I have read some of their other work, and everybody's got very interesting ways about writing the sort of complicated characters. But you have written Mon Mothma before, not only in Contingency Plan, the short story, but also in one of my very favorites, Victory's Price. Specifically, the final chapter of that book healed something in me. But like, she's trying to establish a new government in Victory's Price, whereas in Mask of Fear, she's trying to retain kind of what is left of the life that she knew and the world that she knew. Now that you've written her at multiple points in her journey, how did you approach her character differently, given the change in time and focus, as well as kind of the added context of Genevieve O'Reilly's portrayal of her, if that played any role in how you crafted her in this story?
Yeah, so and I would add on to that, not just the portrayal, but also the new context about her family life set up in Andor. That was something that hadn't really been part of the character before, and really did need to get folded into my understanding of who she was, where she came from, how she gets to where she is. There are elements of Mon that never do change, right? Her strengths remain her strengths, and honestly, some of her weaknesses remain her weaknesses. Her understanding of herself and her understanding of her surroundings changes substantially. And in some ways, it's interesting to think about her as she's at the top of her game as a politician in the Mask of Fear, and yet there's only so much that matters. Right? This is a moment where politics can only get you so far, but she is she is powerful, she is influential, she has all of the connections that she's ever going to have in the political sphere. She's Yeah, she's kind of at the top of her game, but that only matters so much. You compare that to where she is, at the time of Andor, when she is essentially a military leader at that point. She is holding together a coalition of rebels, which is, that was never her dream growing up. And then back out on the other side many many years later, around the New Republic Victories Price period, she's getting back to where she wants to be, but she's coming at it having seen so much, having seen so much of what has gone wrong, what can go wrong. It is not the world that she wanted to apply her skills to, but she's finally back in that game in a very real way, and it is almost bittersweet, I think. And that's obviously my very broad brush painting of where she goes over the years. But I find her a really interesting character. I've said this elsewhere, but I'll say it again. I think so much of her power comes from the paradoxes inside her, from her own, and I mean this in a far less horrid way than it sounds, her own weaponized hypocrisy. She is a person who is able to embody certain contradiction. She is able to eventually lead an anti-government rebellion while still being inside that government. She is able to cut backroom deals that she doesn't particularly like, while saying absolutely different things to her constituency. She is a deep believer in pacifism who is going to help start a civil war, and her ability to live in that space, not always comfortably, but knowingly, and to take that, and to take that tension and turn it not into something that breaks her, but something that she can apply to make change. I find endlessly fascinating, and that is one of the things that I think remains true in her throughout the entirety of the the era that we've ever seen her in.
Yeah, you mentioned weaponized hypocrisy, and it makes me think of Luthen Rail's like epic episode 10 One Way Out monologue, where he says, "I'm condemned to use the tools of my enemy to defeat them.
Absolutely.
I burn my decency for someone else's future." And like I think, throughout this book, it's all of our characters are sort of learning how to operate within this new world, and like a lot of the things that worked before aren't going to work anymore, and they're going to have to change the rules a little bit, and burn their own decency here and there in order to make some tough decisions and to fight another day. Because is it better to make too much of a stir and be out of the fight, or is it better to stay in the fight and maybe make some change or inspire some change behind the scene and use your enemy's tools to defeat them ultimately, right? And so, yeah, I think that's one of the reasons I loved Mon in this book, was like her sort of coming to a little bit of that realization throughout the book. And we know that later on when she, Gorman massacre happens, and that's her last straw in Rebels. But yeah, there's just so many interesting places that these characters are in at this time.
Yeah, and you mentioned the need to make these compromises, and for me, one of the interesting things about working in Star Wars specifically is that there is the question hovering above it all of, are these compromises needed, or are they just the best thing that these characters can figure out? Because this is a setting in which there are absolute heroes who really are deeply pure of heart and largely manage to avoid those compromises. And the notion that hope is out there, but maybe not everyone has the tools or the self-knowledge or the willingness to sacrifice to get there, their lives are much murkier, and they may strive towards that heroism, but they don't know how to get there, and they're having to make the calls all the time of, is this a necessary compromise? Is this just me taking a shortcut because I'm not the hero that a Jedi would be? Or is this the only way out that I've really got? And I think a setting that was murkier across the board would not have as much tension in that regard. There would be an understanding of, well, yes, everyone's going to get their hands dirty at some point. In Star Wars, that it hurts more to see that, and it it resonates in a different way. I think in the real world, we may not have we may not have a lot of examples that we can point to and say that that person is absolutely pure and good in all of their choices, but we have our ideals, right? We have our hopes, and Star Wars makes those manifest and allows that dramatic tension to take place within the text.
It's really interesting because it's like George built on these archetypes and the good versus evil. And in so many stories that have come after that, and even in, the prequels and the stories that he created, it becomes more layered and more murky. So we do have that ideal of like a pure good, but also then you see all of these other players and people get to interpret on that, which is really compelling. And we've talked a little bit about Saw, we've talked a little bit about Mon. We can't leave this conversation without talking a little bit about Bale, because I was so excited that a Bale was popping up in this book, because I think Bale should be everywhere, even though he kind of already is everywhere. I just am a Bale fan. I have been since I was like 7. It's just how it's going to be. And he's a really interesting character in this book because we see him kind of make those compromises, based on choices that he didn't make and then choices that he ultimately does make. But he carries a lot of guilt and also a lot of knowledge about the Jedi Order and their eradication and what happened there, especially given Padme and Leia, and now he is this father and is trying to navigate that at the same time. He wants to uncover the truth of what happened to the Jedi in the name of justice. He's also, publicly a thorn in Palpatine's side and someone who is a kind of a people person. How would you kind of characterize his journey here in this story, as he is kind of at the infancy of his journey as a rebellion leader specifically? It seems like he really didn't have much hope towards that until it was kind of thrust upon him, especially having to work with Mon, who he doesn't always really agree with.
No, he there is a lot of tension between him and Mon in this particular story. Without giving too much away, I think I can say that Bale is Bale is grieving the loss of the Jedi. Of course, he had deep friendships with folk inside the Order. And he wants to not just clear their name, but to honor their legacy in the way that he acts. He has always been more of a man of action than someone like Mon Mothma. We see that in the Clone Wars cartoon, for example, right? He's much more likely to race out. We see him as the person rescuing Yoda from the Emperor in Revenge of the Sith. He's he wants to be a Jedi in some respect, right? Like not in the sense of, he's not delusional. He knows that he's not a superhero. He doesn't have magical powers, but he wants to live up to what he sees as the great virtues of the Jedi, particularly at this point in time. He wants to do it in part to shield his daughter as well, who he sees as uh, Leia is going to need to take on the burden if he doesn't deal with it. So he is not approaching it. He's not approaching the problem of the Empire even really as a politician at this point. He is blinded by his sense that righteousness must prevail to a large extent, and that is a noble it is a noble way of looking at it. And righteousness has value, but it is not sufficient, and that is I don't think I'm spoiling the ending here. I think it's fairly clear from early on that his journey is going to run into certain difficulties. But how far can he go down that path, and how far can he learn to develop the tools, to use the tools that he has as a leader and politician to succeed at it, versus is he going to have to just abandon that path altogether and go down a different road? That's the struggle that he is facing with the struggle that he is facing throughout this book.
Makes you think of Batman, where it's like, Batman's the hero Gotham deserves, but not the one it needs right now, and so it's like, is Bale's noble mission the one that the galaxy needs, or is it not? And that's a question that, like you said, is unpacked and analyzed throughout the book. And I think that's why I was so like honed in on his journey of like him discovering some truths about himself and about the galaxy at large. So he's such a good character. I love that he's popped up in Obi-Wan. He's popped up here. I hope he's in season 2 of Andor. We'll see. But like, he's such a fascinating character. I love him. I love him so much.
He's having a bit of a moment.
Yeah.
There is a Bale resurgence. Yes, and you say that the journey that he's on is unpacked and analyzed, and I hope not fully answered, right? I hope that there is plenty of room for readers to judge on their own, where, if anywhere along the way, mistakes were made, or if ultimately, looking back, no, this was the best way he could have gone about it. These were necessary steps that he had to take. I think it's difficult to look at any of the characters in this book and fully judge within the context of their time where things went wrong. Obviously, it didn't all go perfectly, because the Empire lasts another 20 years. In an ideal world, someone would have found the perfect solution in the first months after Revenge of the Sith, but these characters don't. That's no spoiler. We know that the Empire is not going to end, but teasing apart, yes, where were mistakes made? Where were good intentions and good planning simply insufficient? Is something that I hope gives plenty of grist for people to examine.
Well, there's definitely going to be a lot to examine in the many, many weeks ahead. I'm so excited for people to get their hands on this book. It's so good. I would buy all the different editions that are out there, if not for like just trying to exercise self-control in the year 2025. So I'm doing my best. I got my one copy, but we'll see. We'll see if that changes. But thank you so much for joining us. It was honestly such a pleasure to have you back. This is your third time with us, the Three Timers Club. So special honor here. Take it as an award.
No, thank you so much. I remember really enjoying our previous conversation, so I was excited to see the request to come on. It's been a wonderful conversation.
We hope it's not the last. Don't let it be 4 years again. That's hurting our feelings over here.
There's only so many times I can reread the Alphabet Squadron trilogy and the Rogue One novelization and Twilight Company in this book,
Yeah, truly. I mean, there's never too many bad times to read it, so it's we're overdue for a reread at this point. But hope to have you back again. Where can our folks find you online, and what do you have coming up in the works that you can talk about, and any other work that people should check out?
Yeah, so my online presence is it's a bit of a dim light right now, but folks can find my sporadic social media presence on Blue Sky at Alexander M. Freed. I've also got a long out of date website at alexanderfreed.com, but there you can find a bibliography of my work, as well as a lot of articles on the craft of writing and video game writing in particular. That is where most of my hours in any given day are spent. I can't talk too much about any upcoming projects right now, but please let it be known that I am keeping busy and hope to have more to say at some point in the future.
So it's like, keep your eyes on press announcements, keep your eyes on your Blue Sky account if you have something to share. I mean, we definitely will be, because we love reading your work and love seeing what you have going on. So, thank you so much for writing. Thank you so much for spending your time here today with us. We really, really do appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah. So thank you once again, Alexander. It was a pleasure having you. And until next time, may the force be with you.
May the force be with you.
Thank you all for listening to our interview with Alexander Freed. And once again, The Mask of Fear is on bookshelves. You should go read it. We love this book. This book is so dang good. And now is as good of a time as ever, with Andor season 2 right around the corner. So I would say, even though it's not a tie-in, it is a great, great precursor to get in that Andor mindset. Andor, it's going to be an Andor. It's going to be an Andor. It's going to be an April of Andor. There's things going on here, Friends of the Force, so stay tuned. But we'll have more on that very soon.
Are you hinting at the possibility of an Andor April?
Maybe. We'll see. We'll see. We'll give the people what they want, But you can find us if you want to know more about what that might be. Follow us on Blue Sky. We are also on Instagram. We have a YouTube channel as well, where we post all of our episodes, and make sure you're subscribed to our podcast feed wherever you listen. So go check us out, follow us, stay in touch, and stay up to date on the pod.
We also have a Patreon where we are so grateful for folks who help us keep the lights on here at Friends of the Force. Very seriously, the lights are kept on because of your support. So thank you to Brian, Ben, Cheryl, Clay, Comment, David, Emma, Jennifer, Katie, Knights of Ren, Krista, Logan, Lucy, Lindsay, Matthew, Nicole, Rob, Bruce, Santa, Soulcatcher, Sky Talkers, Tom, Travis, Jules, Viglef, and Andy, our newest patrons. Thank you all very much for your support, and thank you to everybody who takes the time out of your day to join us here at Friends of the Force for a conversation about Star Wars. We are all so grateful. Please be taking care of yourself. Please be hydrating. Please be staying warm if you live in a cold climate like myself and Brad. And please, happy reading always.
Thank you all for listening. We'll see you next time, and may the force be with you always.